Okay, if I could ask everyone to take a seat, please. Okay, it is now 11:20, and so I resume the hearing. Mr. Linus?
Nothing to say, sir. Waiting for you, sir.
Okay, fine. Right, so I think, Mr. Linus, that you'd finished the sequence that you wanted to go through. Is that right?
That's right, sir. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. The quickest on the buzzer, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. And I only did that on the basis that I suspect others are going to be slightly longer in their comments. But I've just got 2 points to make. The first was on the back of the question you raised about compensation. And I think it's relevant to my case and probably many others in that I've got a main urban extension, and it's my understanding, sir, that we're actually setting the greenbelt boundaries, certainly the inner boundaries, for the first time. And what that means is that if and when these sites are actually allocated and adopted, is that those sites were never in the greenbelt. And even though it's over 5 hectares in site, then I don't understand what the compensatory element is for land to be allocated if it was never actually in the greenbelt in the first place. So that's just a point that I came up with on the back of comments raised by yourself. But I think my main point, and I'll keep it brief, is I think the council's actually approached the assessment on setting boundaries on the understanding that they are in fact releasing land from the greenbelt rather than setting the greenbelt for the first time. And I think the whole of the methodology has been to look at the existing boundaries with a great deal of scrutiny and assume that they are protecting the residents in the first instance in releasing land from their greenbelt. And I don't think that's right, because as we've recognised before, is that because we're setting the greenbelt boundary for the first time, they ought to be paying more attention to what the land actually, how that land operates next to the boundary and whether it functions as the green belt. And I know I will come back to this at the phase 3, but I've got a main urban extension which has got a slither of green belt inserted between it and the main urban area, such that it really doesn't operate as a main urban area, but because the council's focus has been setting the boundaries so tightly, they've overlooked the land that sits immediately beyond that boundary. And I think that's my main criticism. I don't think, even though the council has gone into a great deal of detail as to how it's been considering the greenbelt purposes, I think it hasn't taken that final step of stepping back and considering those areas against the main urban area and their function. And I think many of those areas actually don't operate as greenbelt.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Johnson. I should say, and Mr. Johnson very nearly did this, but in the end didn't, for which I'm grateful. We will be having sessions that are looking at each and every section of Greenbelt boundary that's proposed. So I don't want to go into discussions about any detailed section and, you know, what's right or wrong in your view with that. So if we can leave all of that for another day. Today is very much about the robustness of the methodology. The question of the way in which it's been applied will be picked up later on. Mr. Corsia.
Thank you, sir. I was wondering how to cut into this, because there are our representations vary from the very specific about heritage assets right up to the total methodology. So I'll start on the specifics, sir. Heritage assets, obviously we discussed these at long length of phase 1. We consider, sir, that the council still is considering heritage assets in the wrong way. And so if I take you to pages 73, 74 of the new addendum, and you look at the detailed questions, and they include: does the land need to be kept permanently open to understand the original siting or context of a building, landmark or monument? Does land need to be kept permanently open to understand the visual provenance, dominance, prominence or role of a building, landmark? Does the land need to be kept permanently open for tranquility? And then, sir, under landscape and setting, does the land need to be kept permanently open to the understanding or significance for the situation of a designated park or garden? Those are very specific questions to establish whether land needs to be kept open to protect the setting of individual heritage assets. So that, in our view, I think it's a view you expressed in your last letter, that is not the fundamental purpose of Greenbelt. It may be an associated benefit, but you should not set, that is not the intention of setting boundaries. And so if there's any doubt, I again draw you to paragraph 825 of the same document, where it says, in some cases, the open setting of these assets can add to the significance or understanding of the monument itself or the wider landscape. It's quite clear what the council is trying to do in this methodology is to protect the settings of individual assets. Now, the council may have now realised their mistake and are trying to row back from that, but that is clearly what the methodology seeks to do. And so we simply say that has introduced a serious error in the methodology, which the council cannot row back from by just simply stating, well, it doesn't really matter too much. And so if you want to get an example, there are many, many examples. If you go through about 700 or 800 page appendices, but so section 5, boundary 16, page A3, 14, 2.1 and 2.2, it actually says the land should be kept permanently open to understand the original siting and context of All Saints Church and its setting, and to understand the visual prominence and role of this building. That is not a Greenbelt purpose, sir. And the council, as I say, have introduced considerable error. Your question 2.2.b, sir, is this a different methodology? And so I think this is relevant, sir, because this is justification for the boundaries set out in the submitted plan. And so the council shouldn't be altering the justification at this point. They can adduce further evidence, but this is justification, sir, and that's different in our submission. And so we have this attempt by the council to actually say this is an update or a clarification or a simplification. So this is a wholly new methodology. And so as such, it falls foul of what you actually specifically told the council they should not do, which is to introduce a new methodology. And so if you remember the original methodology, first of all, attempted to look at took a strategic overview of the four purposes, excluding the fifth, and produced, as I recall, figure 7, sir. That was their strategic overview of what land it was needed to be kept permanently open. The Council's new methodology has done totally away with taking any strategic overview. It is no more than a field-by-field appraisal. And the Council have today admitted, sir, that they have gone out again and, at this stage, and done that field-by-field appraisal. So this is a completely new, a completely new methodology, sir, and secondly, it's a completely new appraisal based upon very different criteria, even on the site-specific, sir. And I won't go through those, sir. You could take those away and look at them and look at the difference between the two. They are very different. Another important difference, sir, and this is, we think is very significant. The previous methodology, sir, actually gave you some assessment of the harm that may be caused to the greenbelt purposes by the strategic sites. It was some form of justification for the strategic sites. That appendix to the original addendum has now been withdrawn, and there is now no consideration in the new methodology of potential harm of the strategic sites. So that has consequences for you when you are considering the MPPF paragraph 14 point, which we've raised earlier in the hearings. The only appraisal is of the new settlement sites in that regard, and not the other strategic sites. And so if you need any evidence that it is a wholly new methodology, in our hearing statement we give you a long list of what are quite significant alterations to greenbelt boundaries produced by this new methodology, including the exclusion of whole villages which were previously overwashed but now have been excluded. So can we just go to that's the detail. If we can go, sir, to what we think is actually wrong with the Council's approach, why it isn't adequate within the meaning of the MPPF. Firstly, sir, we consider there are two fundamental elements when you're establishing a local plan greenbelt. You should first of all identify the land which fulfills the greenbelt purposes. And then, if necessary, identify sites to be excluded in order to meet needs. And so we do agree with, I think it's called the Spatial Principle 11 of CYC 59, page 39, that you should adopt the least harm. Our only caveat, sir, is you should take into account all the greenbelt purposes and not just the primary purpose. But of course, to do that, sir, I go back to the point I made earlier, that this methodology doesn't actually establish the degree of harm of most of the strategic sites. And so I want to avoid getting into merits of sites, but if I could we think that the evidence is not sufficient to, is not adequate, sir. So if I could take you up to what evidence you actually have in front of you. So you have the greenbelt appraisals, which actually led to, I think, to the areas identified in figure 3.1 of the submitted local plan. And I think we've now reached a point where probably the council would say they identified the most important areas for setting, not all the areas. You have the topic paper update of 2014, which we generally accept, sir, does identify the 3 principal character elements. I can't actually recall how they're called, principal characteristics, which go to the setting and special character of York. But that is not site-specific, sir. It simply gives you examples. Then, sir, you have a very big jump. You have the strategic sites, which are appraised in the heritage impact appraisals, which were produced in 2017, and we say were simply an attempt to validate decisions already taken by the council, because by that time the council had actually chosen their strategic sites. And you have the new evidence. That is the totality of the Greenbelt evidence you have in front of you. And of course the heritage topic, just to make the point, because I think there's confusion here. You have the heritage topic paper deals not only with, it deals primarily with heritage insofar that's its primary focus rather than Greenbelt. And there is I think this has given rise to some confusion within the council's evidence. And then, sir, so far as strategic sites are concerned, you have the appraisals on, in the sustainability assessment. We say what's totally lacking in this evidence base is a strategic overview of the type which the council accepted in the first methodology was necessary. So if you look, taking forward the principal characteristics, you have obviously one of the most significant aspects of York are views, You have no indication, no evidence, sir, in front of you about what are the most important landmark monuments, or which are the most important views of those landmark monuments. Since it would seem when you're dealing with a primary purpose to protect the setting and special character of a historic town of international importance, and I'll again remind you, sir, that what Mr. Oxley said, that it now has, it is a candidate World Heritage Site, you would expect a basic views appraisal to form the evidence base. But we also know, sir, if you're just picking up page 57 of the Heritage topic paper, that not only are views important into York, but also views out, sir, and to quote it under landscape and setting, views out to the Wolds, Moors and Howardian Hills. So you have absolutely no evidence about these views in front of you. And really, sir, doing a field-by-field appraisal in a type which is done by the council really isn't helpful to that. You would expect first of all, that basic work of trying to establish what are important views and what are not. And so the other point we would make, and I really hesitate to get into site specifics, is that...
Yes, you should.
What I'm really would emphasise to you, and I don't mind doing it now, so to give you an example, or do it actually under the next matter statements, but there are major inconsistencies in how the council has appraised individual sites, and including the strategic sites, sir. Between the, I won't, to help you, sir, to get into it, there are some in the heritage impact assessment, serious harm is identified to character and setting. But by the time it ends in the SA, sir, it becomes only minor harm on the SA objective 14, I think. There are major inconsistencies in the evidence base. And sir, and again, in the new evidence, sir, you have statements about the potential harm which, going beyond what seems to be the defined boundary, they're recognising. As far as I can see, what they've done, sir, is, particularly in the vicinity of strategic sites, they've looked at a boundary which excludes the strategic site, and then assessed the land beyond, identified harm, and then simply said, well, the heritage impact assessment says there's an opportunity for development, full stop, and move on from there. And so that, again, gives you a high degree of inconsistency of evidence.
Yeah, I think you're going there to the application of the method and also potentially the site selection methodology. Now, in terms of the application of this methodology that we're looking at today, as I say, we'll pick that up another time, but I'll take what you've just said as a marker that you're going to pick that up later on.
Well, so it goes to the methodologies, because if the methodology allows such, if the methodology is not establishing, if you have inconsistent statements in the various in the outputs from the evidence-based documents, which don't actually tie up then into the all-important essays, sir, then that is a fundamental error of the methodology. But the fundamental point I'm making, sir, is that the strategic sites have not been properly appraised in terms of potential harm to greenbelt purposes. So that's all I want to say at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Corsia. Mr. Good.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep some of this relatively brief, as some of the points Mr. Corsia has covered already. In particular, we still have concerns with regards to Purpose 4 and the setting of the historic town. Now, we understand how that works for York, but in our case, we still struggle with how, for example, the historic core of villages, etc., relate back to the historic setting of the city itself. It seems to conflate the issue of whether it's a historic town or whether it's an area which could be dealt with under other mechanisms, such as development management policies or other more appropriate ways of dealing with these things, rather than setting a greenbelt boundary. Similar to Mr. Corsia, we also picked up on the landmark monuments issue, and again, the council seem to fail, and if they have done this, I'm sure they'll point me in the right direction, but they seem to fail to identify what are the most important landmark features for this area. What is it that we're specifically trying to protect? And whilst I understand the historic topic paper, the heritage topic paper, sorry, and I've read that in detail, that doesn't very easily transfer into the Greenbelt. And the views of the Minister are mentioned, but then so are various other aspects of listed buildings, conservation areas, right down to things like herdsmen's huts and boundary markers as well. So which, some of those, I understand that the council say that they've considered them as a context point rather than a defining point. But that doesn't necessarily seem to follow through on some of their summaries of why they've actually identified boundaries. Now, I won't go to individual boundaries at this stage, sir, because I know that's for a later stage, but it's to set the marker that we do have some concerns as to how that's actually translated in practice. And the final point, which hasn't really been mentioned at this stage, is, and I haven't found any detail on it, is how those boundaries themselves have actually been determined in terms of what are they going to analyse in terms of the boundary itself. So some of those boundaries are actually quite significant and quite large. They cut across significant landscape features such as railway lines, roads, etc., major roads, where one element of that boundary would have a significantly different impact upon the greenbelt to other elements. Now, if we take large, wide boundaries, then obviously that multiplies up and scale is an issue, because you may find that some areas will perform better, worse, if you zoom in a little bit. Now, clearly there's an issue of scale and appropriateness of the evidence base at this stage, sir, but I do think where we're crossing significant landscape features, there should be a consideration as to whether that boundary should be determined differently, be on one side of that issue, sorry, one side of that feature or the other. So it's that, and it may be that I'm missing it, sir, and I'm sure the council will fill me in if I am, but I don't see anywhere where the issue of how they've determined to look at the individual boundaries has been considered.
Mr. Wright.
So before I start, just two things, if I could just clarify them. When I submitted my hearing statement, I sent hard copies of the 1998 proposals map and the current proposals map submitted in this for two sets, one for each inspector to have available. I hope you have been given those. Because I make the important point that only by looking at it in hard copy rather than on the computer screen can you actually see the similarity.
I don't think we have, Mr. Wright, no.
Well, I sent them to Mrs. Crook, sir, and asked them to be sent on to you, and two sets I sent. Quite expensive to put in the post, I have to say, because it's that amount of documents. There's two plans on each, and quite expensive for me to reproduce as well. So there must be somewhere, and if you haven't got them now, then I will get another set made and deliver them to Mrs. Crooks to hand to you later on. But it is an exercise that I did request you to do, which was to open them up and just compare them visually, as a visual exercise.
Yeah, we'll ask Mrs. Crooks. It may or may not be that she has them. I simply don't know.
Well, I'll get another set made then, sir, and deliver them to her anyway.
Well, I'd suggest you hold off going to the expense of printing another set. It may just be that Carol might have them, or they may have sort of gone to my, or one of them might have gone to my predecessor, and still need to come back to me. So when did you submit them?
When I put in the hearing statement.
So some time ago. Okay, that's helpful to know. Just hold on. I'd hold on with it for now.
So the second thing is that what I'm going to comment on is the council's submission to you about how they created this, and I intend or would prefer to read it to you because it's got lots of cross-references in, and because it's got that and you have to take minutes or notes of it, I've brought you copies of what I'm going to say, and I'm going to stick to it if that will be helpful to you. I've also got a copy for the council's counsel.
We would be most grateful.
Sorry, sir, can I just ask, I haven't obviously read or heard this, but can I just, why this hasn't been produced until now?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a note that Mr. Wright would otherwise be able to deliver orally, I'm more than happy to receive it in writing.
So, are you all right for me to proceed now?
Probably. I mean, obviously, I haven't read it, so
No, sir,
I'm going to say yes on the assumption that it doesn't stray from the points that you've made previously. But...
Sir, I'm going to read it verbatim. So I'm just giving it to you so that you could follow it through and then make sure that what's on your paper is exactly what I say to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Go ahead, Mr. Wright.
The question for which you requested a simple summary from the Council is, how were the boundaries of the Greenbelt arrived at? I dispute the explanation given by the Council. The boundaries which you are considering are those set on the proposals map 2 sheets, and which were deposited or submitted with the local plan in May 2018. There have been some very minor alterations proposed, but essentially the proposals map indicate the boundaries under discussion. In addition to those maps, I will just list the 4 occasions when the Council have submitted material to support those maps. Firstly, in the submission of the plan, they lodged 3 so-called evidence-based documents related to these proposals: the 2003 Greenbelt approach SD 107, which was a document produced for the 1998 local planning inquiry to justify the boundaries set on the proposals map of that plan, and SD 103, SD 106, SD 107 relating to historic character and setting of and heritage, a total of 122 pages. Secondly, immediately following the submission of the plan and its evidence, in May 2018, the Council submitted Topic Paper 1. This was not submitted in response to any concerns raised by the inspectors, but set out the methodology claimed for the resolution of the boundaries. Its timing had consequences that it was not addressed in the consultation. It seems to me that if it would have been more appropriate, for that material to have been available for comment in the consultation. You might consider why it was presented in that way. It comprises 33 pages. Thirdly, in response to concerns raised by the inspectors, addendums of TP1 were submitted in the examination in March 2019 by the Council, comprising 463 pages. Fourthly, in response to the inspectors' further concerns, a group of documents described as Topic Paper 1 Addendum, dated January 2021, with annexes A to J were lodged. It stated that these papers were to clarify the methodology. The first sentence of the first document states at paragraph 1.1, this document is a revision of the TP1 addendum. I was misled by that statement, as it does not state the original TP1 is revised by these documents. These addendums comprise 1,595 pages of text and plans. The Council's Greenbelt proposals are set out on the proposals map, which were dated at the date of submission, supported by 122 pages of evidence, and now by an additional 1,595 pages. Thus, what was presented at the pre-submission consultation is 7% of what now is before you, excluding any hearing statements. My counter-argument is based on the proposals maps, the 1998 proposals maps, and an extract from the 1998 local plan comprising 9 pages. The 1998 proposals map are at my original response consultation, Annex 5, Tab 6. And the pages from the 1998 plan at Annex 3, Tab 9, pages 602 to 611. All my material is simply factual, and those facts are: 1, the proposal's map of this plan mirror the 1998 local plan, except where subsequent development has intervened, and this is only on the inner boundary. The 1998 proposal's map for the Greenbelt boundaries strictly replicated those of the 1990 York Greenbelt local plan. That was because that approach allowed the council to avoid objections addressed in the 1990 inquiry process being repeated in the 1998 inquiry. So if I can just step off the script, that's the reason for this, the pages that I've given you. So going back to the script, neither the 1990 nor the 1998 proposals map were adopted. In the case of the 1998 plan, because its Greenbelt proposals were considered by the inspector to be unacceptable because of the short-term basis of those Greenbelt proposals. Both plans were not required to be evidence-based, and neither was subject to an assessment of soundness. It is apparent from comparing the 1998 proposals map with those submitted in this examination that the boundaries have been replicated. My case is how the boundaries were established for the submitted plan. The council set out a process described in 4 stages in their response to question 7.1a. But they do not say when the events occurred. There is no record of this process occurring prior to May 2018. The council had countless meetings to address local plan and Greenbelt issues between 1998 and 2019. But there are no agendas, reports or minutes which indicate this process occurred or was ever discussed. I and others in this room have boxes full of meeting agendas and reports for the period and are aware that the overriding topic for debate related to the proposals for development site allocations. There have been no alternative options or discussions about defining boundaries. There was just an assumption that those boundaries set in the 1998 plan were the boundaries to be used in this plan process. I submit to you the process described in the council's hearing statement could not have occurred prior to the submission of the plan in May 2018. Thus, the position must be the proposals map were deposited were just the former proposals of the 1998. Not evidence-based, adjusted only by intervening development, and the council have now undertaken an evidence-based exercise as set out in the January 2021 paper. Miraculously, it produces a result almost identical of that unevidenced proposal of 1990 and 1998. I commend to you in your inquisitorial role to ask yourselves the question, is it believable that the outcomes could be the same? First and foremost, the earlier plans were not evidence-based. Secondly, the 1990 inspector, if the 1990 inspector had to determine soundness, the proposals would have failed on 2 counts. First, they were not consistent with national policy because PPG 2, 1988, it stated the general extent was 50,000 acres. Based on a 6-mile outer radius, the inner radius to encompass 50,000 acres would have been well beyond the outer ring road, in line with that demonstrated on the RSS key diagram, and accurately plotted on a plan submitted in my response to the consultation at Annex 5, tab 12. Secondly, the 1990 inspector stated the basis for resolving the outer boundary was to start from a 6-mile radius and using the most appropriate defensible boundary feature closest to it. So, I have at this point to correct evidence I have previously submitted about the centre point for the 6-mile radius. I have stated it was the central tower of the Minster, and that information was before the 1990 inquiry. I wish to correct that. That information derives from the consultation plan issued in December 1990 by North Yorkshire County Council, and that is at my Annex 5, tab 1. Mr. Shepherd, the inspector in 1992, did raise the point which is recorded at paragraph B13.6, internal page 17 of his report, where he stated, St Sampson's Square is a convenient, appropriate choice. He did accept it was a point, not an area. That must be right, because if it was an area, say, that within the walls, there would be it would possibly say be a mile wide. And the outer boundary measured from its edge would make the outer boundary a distance of up to 7 miles from the furthest point of that centre. So the outcome would not achieve what is meant in plain English. Whilst referring to that report, I would also direct you to paragraph B13 on internal page 16, where Mr. Shepherd sets out what he regarded as the appropriate way to determine the outer boundary by defining the radius and then seeking a recognisable and durable boundary closest to that point. I commend that approach to you, sir, but also say this is a reasonable alternative methodology which has not been considered by the Council. What is a fact is that the approach was not taken in either 1990 or 1998. Returning then to my submission, there are other reasons that indicate the outcome would be different from that of 1998. And these relate firstly to the overarching policy which changed from that of 1980 structure plan to that of the RSS. The key elements of that change are that the purpose of the York Greenbelt was stated in the RSS policy, but not in the policy in force in 1990 or 1998. That essential purpose therefore gains greater weight today. The policy E8A in the structure plan, in force in both 1990 and 1998, stated that the boundaries should prevent coalescence with existing settlements and regulate the size of urban settlements and preserve open land extending into the urban areas. These policy requirements were all removed and omitted from the RSS policy revision of the overarching policy. The deletion and omission of these specific boundary setting policies in the RSS mirrors the changes to Greenbelt policy arising from the emergence of policies supporting sustainable patterns of development, such as are set out in paragraph 84 of MPPF 2012. The evidence-based documents to support the current proposals, the 2003 approach to Greenbelt appraisal, originally submitted to justify the 1998 proposals as a long-term Greenbelt but rejected by the inspectors, is still being relied on despite these significant changes. The Council's summary paper indicates an analysis of RSS policy and the MPF. This so-called analysis in the 2021 addendum is to be found in 3 relatively short sections of the main paper. There is no analysis of the changes from the earlier policy of the structure plan to that of the RSS. The deletion of the boundary fixing policies of E8A of the structure plan and what impact that would have in respect of previous approaches is simply not mentioned. There is no statement as to how the NPPF policy, particularly paragraph 84, would impact on previous approaches, that places greater weight on preventing coalescence with outlying settlements, even though they were not towns, and as is the focus of national policy in this point. The document does, however, focus on issues relating to the absence of a definition of the precise point of the city centre and the interpretation of the key diagram. To my mind, the so-called analysis seems to be more a riposte to issues raised in the Phase 1 hearings than an analysis to understand how the approach to setting boundaries in the policy context and is delineated on the proposals map. Surely, the policy change of the RSS and those of the structure plan are key elements of understanding the policy context and would highlight the reasons for a change. That would in turn direct consideration to paragraph 84 of the NPPF. It is these matters that are missing, that reveal more about the Council's stance than what they actually say. Whilst there is a view that the key diagram is only indicative, there is another view that it is expressly indicates a green belt which is not tight to the urban core and additionally might represent an area of green belt comparative to that proposed by the Secretary of State in 1988 of 50,000 acres. Another alternative approach. So I conclude in my response that the Council's hearing paper and 2021 material by submitting to you, sir, that, firstly, the issue about the boundaries is best displayed by the proposals map, and they display that the proposals are essentially those of the 1990 local plan and therefore not evidence-based. And, secondly, an objective evidence-based appraisal would indicate that there are a number of appropriate alternative approaches to both the setting of the outer boundary, see paragraph 11 above, and the inner boundary, see paragraph 17 above. The first point indicates the plan is unsound because it is not and never was evidence-based in respect of the Greenbelt boundaries. It is therefore not justified. Secondly, to be justified, it should be considered against reasonable alternatives. I say reasonable alternatives exist and would be apparent in any objective approach. No alternative approaches to either the inner or outer boundary have been considered by the Council in this process. Thirdly, as this is a strategic issue, it is one where alternative approaches should have been the subject of the duty to cooperate discussions, and they have not. Sirs, I invite you to resolve that this plan is unsound.
Thank you for that, Mr. Wright, and I understand the relevance of the maps that you were referring to at the beginning from what you have just read out. Yeah, we will, as I say, check that Carol has that, and if there is an issue, we'll ask her to get in touch with you. Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, sir. I've been sitting here musing about what your reaction would have been if I'd handed in a speaking note. Firstly, sirs, can I just indicate an apology because some of what I'm going to say, I did say in front of Mr. Inspector Berkeley at York Races in 2019, but obviously first time to say it before Mr. Inspector Griffiths, so apologies for that, sir, that you'll hear some of this for the second time. Secondly, an apology. Try to stop echoing. I'm acting on behalf of 4 educational institutions, 3 of whom are in fact noted under the treatment of educational institutions in the topic paper addendum at 7.25. It's absolutely inevitable in terms of what I have to say that I will have to say something in relation to educational institutions in general, particularly tertiary ones, because I'm dealing with it in the generality and the effect of that. But I apologise, and I'll try not to transgress beyond that generality. The next point to make by way of just a few opening observations before getting into the meat of it is, I don't know whether or not you sirs have the 2012 MPPF to hand.
Never leave home without it, Mr. Tucker.
Sits by the bedside. Obviously issued as recently as 10 years ago. Says that there are some relevant paragraphs to the exercise that the Council are engaged in, and I should say our position is not that this plan is fatally flawed, but this plan can be made sound by modifications. So that's our position, just to say this at the outset. And methodologically, it is possible for greenbelt boundaries to be set. But I just make a couple of observations. MPPF 2012 doesn't quite deal with the instance of a greenbelt which is there but whose boundaries haven't been established, or to just pick up on Mr. Johnson's point, the sort of Schrodinger's cat of greenbelt boundaries, that they become established once we actually adopt them. But we know that they're there, but we don't know where they are until the adoption happens. So Schrodinger's greenbelt boundaries aren't dealt with in this particular document, but it does tell us something about what you should be doing when establishing greenbelt boundaries, and there's a couple of points which are important in that regard. So paragraph 82, first of all, tells us that the first point is one has to demonstrate why normal development management policies won't be adequate. The second is you need a good reason to change greenbelt boundaries. Well, that's not applicable. Third point is you need to identify what the consequences are for sustainable development proposals, and that's very much at the heart of what I'm going to say. The next point is a point sufficiently good it's made twice. You need to demonstrate the need for the greenbelt, and then you've got to show how greenbelt would meet other objectives. If I can then just draw one's attention a little bit further down to paragraph 85, having tripped lightly on 84, which says the sustainable patterns of development point yet again. It tells us that you've got to ensure consistency with the local plan strategy, not include land which is unnecessary to keep permanently open, and where necessary, identifying plans, areas of safeguarded land to meet longer term development needs, because penultimate bullet point of 85, you've got the council has to satisfy itself, or rather it does upon your report, sirs, that greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the development plan period. Just touching on that point in relation to the education point, that is not answered by Mr. Wood pointing to the strategic allocations. It's not answered in that regard. So what happens to the University of York, for example, after 2035 isn't answered at all by telling us that, well, there are some strategic allocations that will take a lot longer to develop. But yet that is a point that's got to be grappled with when looking at paragraph 85. We need to be identifying greenbelt boundaries which endure, not greenbelt boundaries which will need immediate review. So in relation to that, therefore, the fundamental point I have to make is, I can put it in one of a number of ways, a sense check point, proof of the pudding point, or if we're in a religious establishment, by his deeds shall you know him, which is to look at what the consequences are of the application of the methodology, to ask whether the methodology is fundamentally correct. One point to note, when you dive into the details, I'm sure you sirs have, of how the methodology has been applied, there are some real problems in terms of that application, the details of which we'll come back to in due course. But for example, describing the University of York as a new settlement seems a little obtuse, but you get that from Annex C. Describing mitigation as being necessary when you are actually identifying boundaries, and that is specifically in the context of Annex C at the University of York, seems a little problematical for the reasons that you sirs have already discussed, and I won't repeat. But the real sense check is the tightness of the boundaries, and that would seem, if I can pick up another thesis that's been put already, that the tightness of the boundaries to existing built development would seem to suggest that the approach has been, if the land is open, it should go in the green belt, rather than, is it necessary for it to go into the green belt, and would ordinary development management policies be sufficient to protect it otherwise? The consequences of that are that for educational establishments, one has huge problems. Let me give you one example, and I do so because it relates to policy ED7, which relates to the College of York as well as Askham Bryan College. That's a positive policy in relation to expansion of facilities. Askham Bryan is washed over the Greenbelt. It has that policy designation. And yet, when one goes to paragraph 7.25 of the addendum to the topic paper, it says it's a rural college which is not considered to be within the urban area and is anticipated to have the capacity to meet its needs without the need to reduce openness. I literally do not know how those two can stand together, and that's a matter we'll return to in the next stage. But there needs to be some sense of consistency, but more importantly, one has to drive where you are setting greenbelt boundaries by those sustainable needs elements, because that's fundamental to what MPPF says. So it's not if the land is open and it's close to the area, urban area, it's greenbelt. That's not what the policy says at all. It's identify what's necessary to be greenbelt, identify what your sustainable needs are, and then one comes to an overall planning judgment in relation to that. Because if you don't, it leads to problems. And the problems are that one's sustainable needs aren't recognised or facilitated by the boundaries. And again, we'll come back to that on the University of York, and I hesitate to say too much because I'm very grateful for the indication that the authority made last week that they wish to engage in a statement of common ground. We embrace that. And when we do, we want it to be an evidence-based statement of common ground directed specifically at that, because that's fundamental to the Greenbelt methodology in certainly my submission. The next point is where you identify boundaries has to be informed by that process. And then the next point is it's got to be consistently undertaken. And there are an array of examples that I could list. But if I do, I suspect I will transgress over the prohibition that you, sir, said this morning. But it is worth reading, and it is worth noting two things, one of which is in relation to, let me get this right, Annex 6, which is the inner boundary. And I just draw your attention to page 23 of the PDF, where there is an amendment to the boundary in relation to St. Olaf's School, which is part of the St. Peter's estate, where the application of the boundary addendum approach that's been taken results in drawing in the boundary even further than it was last time I had a conversation about this over in York Races in 2019. As a sense check, that should be ringing alarm bells to the authority that something's not right. Making it more restrictive doesn't seem quite right in the light of what the task should be. That's one, and then the second example I give relates to the discussion in Annex 3 on page 31 of the PDF in relation to the discussion of the allocation at the university. And as I indicated, it's difficult to see how any of that arises from the methodology which you've heard. But we'll discuss that in due course, because if by their deeds you shall know them, unfortunately, these deeds don't particularly shine well upon the authors of the methodology. Thank you, sirs.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Do you want to come back? We've heard quite a bit, Mr. Linus. I'm conscious of that. Can I hear from the council now?
Yes. Just try to work out which order I'm going to deal with these in. Let's try and do it in reverse order. Then let's do it with Mr. Tucker first of all. First point to make, come as no surprise that the 2012 MPF is familiar to those in this side of the room as well. Just one point to pick up on though. Mr. Tucker read out from paragraph 82 and focused a number of points of his submission on paragraph 82. Of course, one needs to remember that paragraph 82 applies particularly the points he was referring to if one's proposing a new green belt, which is not the position here. Sirs, in your letter, you were very careful to identify the relevant aspects of MPPF, but paragraph 82 does not apply in circumstances where one's not proposing a new green belt, and that's the case here. One takes the point, though, that as Mr. Tucker identified, it's necessary to take into account wider considerations when defining or detailing boundaries, and the considerations that are mentioned at paragraphs 84 and 85 have been taken into account by the Council. So insofar as Mr Tucker refers to the need to promote sustainable patterns of development and ensuring consistency of the local plan strategy for meeting identified requirements for sustainable development, we accept that those are routes into the application of Greenbelt policy, even if we dispute that paragraph 82 specifically should be relied upon. But beyond that point, really, however many ways Mr Tucker wants to put this, whether it's a sense check or otherwise, really what he's doing is complaining about the specific boundary that's been set in relation to his client's land. And essentially that is really a question of the application, we say, of the methodology to be considered at later sessions rather than something that's fundamentally been identified as wrong with the methodology itself. Clearly, as he accepts, there will be planning judgments to be reached which need to take into account questions such as need, but now is not the place to look at the boundary around St Olaf, St Peter's in particular. So I don't think I need to say anything more about the university's contribution, but accept that obviously this will be debated at a later stage, as Mr Tucker accepts. As for Mr Wright's submission...
Apologies, Mr Linus. Just before you move on to Mr Wright's points, just to clarify, is the intention of the discussions with the university to arrive at a statement of common ground which, amongst other things, addresses the question of need?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. We knew you were anticipating a statement of common ground, and we took the view that, as we said at the outset of the examination, I think the debate that's taking place between the council and the university is related to land take to meet what the university thinks it needs to do on its land. And plainly, if that's the area of discussion between the parties, needs going to inform that, and we suspect you wouldn't be helped greatly if those topics weren't covered as part of any statement of common ground that came forward. So need will be considered as part of these discussions.
Even if there isn't agreement on it, then it would be very helpful to us to have quantification of the need on both sides and set out as areas of disagreement if that is still the case at that point.
Yes, as I said, as we said earlier on, sir, the council has yet to be satisfied that the land take that the universities say they need based on universities' needs has been established. If we can reach agreement on some aspects of the university's position, that will go into statement of common ground, but we would try and identify statements of uncommon ground as well. As for Mr Wright, I can be quite brief. Just raising, I think, seven points in relation to his submissions. First one is to note his view that what we're now proposing are only very minor alterations to what was proposed originally. We don't disagree with that, and it tends to support our position that the revised methodology has not resulted in fundamental changes to the Greenbelt boundaries we were proposing before. The second point, insofar as Mr Wright refers to being misled by the statement about the titling of the document, I think Mr Elvin covered that earlier on in the examination. We accept that the reference to TP1 addendum as currently stated needs to be seen in the context where effectively this is a document which sets out the current position of the council in its entirety as far as the methodology is concerned. But it's quite clear, we say, from a proper reading of that document that this is really what the council has been seeking to do, to set out its current position on Greenbelt matters generally in that document. The third point really comes to the nub of what Mr Wright said, which is the suggestion that really the boundaries that have been established for the submitted plan are those which were in the 1998 proposals map, as if it's being suggested that we've simply taken what was on the proposals map and replicated it in the latest proposal. That is a travesty of the position. Mr. Wright, elsewhere in his statement, refers to the fact that the new addendum comprises 1,595 pages of text and planned, and it can hardly be an accurate description of the Council's process that we've effectively just taken, dusted off the 1998 proposals map and somehow presented that to you as the Greenbelt boundaries in this case. The extensive work that has been done according to the methodology that's been explained today belies that proposition. Fourth point is that Mr. Wright submits that the process described in our hearing statement couldn't have occurred prior to the submission of the plan in May 2018. Well, obviously, as Mr. Wood has explained, the methodology has been revised and we revisited work that was presented to you at the phase 1 of the examination. But again, even a cursory look at the documentation in the latest addendum shows that there was clearly evidence-based documents which had been prepared well in advance of the submission of the plan, which were taken into account in the process leading to the submission of the plan in May 2018. The Greenbelt appraisal dates back to 2003. The Heritage technical papers updated that in 2011 and 2014. You have a Heritage impact appraisal from 2017. So we simply don't accept that somehow there has been a process whereby the Council has simply only started looking at Greenbelt boundaries in any real depth following the submission of the plan. It's just an inaccurate reflection of the work that's been done. Moving on, the fifth point I want to make is the commendation by Mr. Wright that you in your inquisitorial roles should ask a question about whether it's believable that the outcome of this plan could be the same as what he describes as unevidenced proposals from 1990 and 1998. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever for you to ask yourself that question, sir. It'd be pointless to do so. And insofar as Mr. Wright invites you to enter into the twilight zone of asking whether earlier plans were evidence-based, it's entirely wrong that you should do that. It's not for you to establish whether previous plans were evidence-based. The task for you is to look at this plan and the evidence that's presented to you in the Greenbelt work that's been discussed today. The sixth point is that Mr. Wright then moves, I think, into territory that is actually trespassing into areas where you said, sir, you weren't going to go today, but I'll cover them very briefly. He says that the 1990 inspector took a particular approach to the 6-mile radius and the outer boundary. Essentially, sir, this is a matter which has already been addressed at phase 1, you may recall. I'm not going to go back on the debate about the approach that was taken by the Council to the RSS policy. This isn't a question of reasonable alternatives in a policy sense. It's a question of what the interpretation of the RSS policy should be. We addressed that at phase 1 and we dealt with it in the clarification note at EXCYC 39, which followed the phase 1 sessions and which was the subject of your letter. Nothing in what we have seen from Mr. Wright should disturb what we said at the earlier sessions or anything that you have said in your letter on this
I'm
issue.
not, Mr. Linus, in the habit of changing my mind.
That's understood, sir, and we're not suggesting that you should. The seventh point is in a similar vein. Mr. Wright invites you to look at the history of the structure plan to the RSS. Again, we don't say this actually takes matters any further. You have to look at the RSS as saved, which is what you have done, and you set out your conclusions on the interpretation of the RSS in your letter, and we see no reason to revisit that as you have indicated. So, for those reasons, sir, with respect to Mr. Wright, he's either raising matters which have been dealt with before and hasn't identified any points which suggest they need to be revisited, or he has fundamentally misrepresented the work that's been done as part of this plan. If I can move on to other statements that were made, I'm sure Mr. Wood will add further points. Mr. Good raised points about the approach to villages, I think directing his attention to Strensel in particular, without saying so. Insofar as he raised concern about how villages were being treated in respect of Purpose 4, as Mr. Wood has explained, in the particular contexts of York, the relationship between villages and York is an aspect of the historic character and setting of York. And that much is clear from the general comments made by Historic England about the distribution of settlements and the approach taken by the council to the clock face, as Mr. Wood put it. So it is relevant to look at villages and the relationship with the historic city as part of Purpose 4. The second point related to the scale of boundaries. Again, this, I think, is really a matter for the detailed boundary sessions, because in reality, when one is looking at setting a boundary as extensive as this, judgments have to be reached at the scale of analysis depending on the area in question. Some parts of the boundary will require a finer grain approach to the length of boundary that's under consideration than others. That's a matter of judgment that can only be properly analysed when looking at the individual sections at later stages. As far as Mr. Kersey's points are concerned, I'll try and pick up the detail in the order in which they were presented. But insofar as Mr. Kersey repeats the point that we have somehow still got it wrong on the approach to heritage assets, in particular landmark monuments, I think, again, he is picking out particular elements of the assessment without looking at them in their broader sense. So if, for example, one takes out the section dealing with the landmark monuments and turn to paragraph 70, or page 73, paragraph 8.24, dealing with landmark monuments, this sets the context for that criterion, where it says the City of York contains many important landmarks, buildings and monuments which can have spatial, temporal or cultural significance to the city and its landscape, and aid the understanding of the city's evolution and relationship to people or the physical environment. That makes it clear that what the council is doing is not simply setting greenbelt boundaries by reference to landmark monuments as individual heritage assets in themselves. The questions are being asked in the context of Purpose 4 as applied to York overall, and trying to understand the role of landmark monuments within the wider application of Purpose 4, as Mr. Wood has explained. And rather than pick out individual examples, I think this will obviously be tested through the detailed boundary session, but that's the broad approach that Mr. Wood has said has been followed. Mr. Kersey went on to say that, well, what the council has done has been what you guarded, what you sought to guard against, sir. As I said, we simply don't accept that. What the revisions to the methodology have required the Council to do is revisit the decisions that were taken on the boundary at a previous stage. And as we said, that has not produced fundamentally different outcomes. I think in one of the letters that was sent to you, sir, explaining the work that had been done as part of the topic paper, just bear with me while I get the reference. One of the letters that was sent, I think it was EXCYC 55, but I'll check it. It confirmed that the changes had resulted in effectively a change of 0.7% to the area of the green belt that had been previously covered. So the outcome, or the spectre that you were fearful of, sir, about fundamentally different outcomes in the plan simply has not been realised. Bear with me, sir. EXCYC 50, I think, is a reference. I'll be told if that's wrong. The third point, 55, sorry, 55. The third point relating to a strategic overview. Again, Mr. Wood has explained that that has been done and it's been set out in detail in sections 5 and 6 of the methodology. Insofar as figure 7, which was in the earlier version of the plan, has been deleted, that's in direct response to the concerns expressed by you, sir, that at a strategic level we'd taken into account, as part of looking at Greenbelt purposes, factors which were not relevant to Greenbelt purposes, and we've moved away from that approach and taken a strategic approach which seeks to define a series of spatial principles based not only on the RSS, but an application of Greenbelt purposes, which are then followed through into the detailed boundaries. So we simply don't